May 10, 1940. Northern France, 04:30 hours. British Lieutenant Ian Roger. English of the Durham Light Infantry stood in a defensive position along the Belgian border, watching the horizon. The son of a mining engineer who had served in the Durham Light Infantry during World War I, English had joined the 8th Battalion in 1938. Now, as dawn broke over Europe, he would witness something that contradicted every assumption about modern warfare. What he saw in the next 6 weeks would shake the foundations of military thinking for generations to come. The German forces were supposed to be inferior. On paper, they were. The Allies had more tanks, more divisions, comparable artillery. France alone fielded 800,000 men and was regarded as the strongest military force in Europe. The British Expeditionary Force had arrived with 390,000 troops, well-trained, well-equipped, confident in their defensive preparations. Yet within 42 days France would fall. The British would retreat across the Channel from Dunkirk. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all conquered. The mathematical impossibility had occurred. A supposedly weaker force had defeated a stronger one through methods the Allies could barely comprehend. This is not a story about equipment superiority. This is not a story about overwhelming numbers. This is the story of how a military machine revolutionized warfare through training, doctrine, and a command philosophy so radically different from its enemies that it created victories that should have been impossible. The transformation began not on the battlefields of World War II, but in the ashes of World War I defeat. November 11th, 1918. Germany had lost the Great War. 4 years of brutal combat had cost nearly 2 million German soldiers their lives. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, imposed crippling restrictions designed to ensure Germany could never again threaten European peace. The German army was limited to 100,000 men. No tanks, no aircraft, no heavy artillery, no poison gas, no general staff system. The elite body of military planners who had guided Prussian and German armies for over a century was officially abolished. The Kriegsakademie, the war academy that had produced some of history's most celebrated military minds, was ordered closed. Germany's military future appeared bleak. Most nations would have accepted these limitations and rebuilt slowly within the constraints. The Germans did something different. They turned restriction into innovation, limitation into opportunity. General Hans Franz, appointed to lead the reduced Reichswehr in 1920, made a decision that would reshape military history. If Germany could only have 100,000 soldiers, they would be the best 100,000 soldiers in the world. Franz's vision was revolutionary. He chose to create a cadre force, an army where every soldier was trained to levels far exceeding their current rank. This was not mere optimism. This was systematic preparation for the day when restrictions would lift and rapid expansion would become possible. Every single man would be trained not just for his current role, but for positions 2 levels above his rank. A squad leader would be trained to command a company. A company commander would be trained to lead a battalion. A battalion commander would be trained to direct a brigade. This was not theoretical training conducted in classrooms alone. This was intensive practical preparation that assumed every leader might suddenly find themselves in charge of a much larger force. The philosophy had deep roots stretching back through Prussian military history. The Prussian military tradition emphasized something called Alpha's tactic mission-type tactics. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity and radical in its implications. A commander would be given a mission objective and told what needed to be accomplished, but not how to accomplish it. This stood in stark contrast to the command philosophies of most armies, where detailed orders specified not just objectives, but the precise methods for achieving them. Alfreg's tactic required trust. It required subordinates who could think independently. It required leaders at every level who understood not just their own mission, but the intent of commanders 2 levels above them. The German training system was designed to create exactly these leaders. Between 1919 and 1933, even under the severe restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, the Germans conducted war games on an unprecedented scale. These were not simple exercises with small units. These were massive systematic simulations of modern warfare, conducted across multiple levels of command simultaneously. Officers practiced coordinating infantry, artillery, and theoretical armored forces that Germany was not yet allowed to possess. They were aimed scenarios involving divisions, corps, and entire armies using forces that existed only on paper. The exercises were brutally honest. Mistakes were analyzed without mercy. Successes were studied for replication. Every officer who participated was expected to prepare after-action reports that would be circulated throughout the officer corps. They studied the lessons of World War I with unflinching analysis. The static trench warfare that had consumed millions of lives was not the future. That style of combat had nearly destroyed Germany. Movement was the future, speed was the future. The ability to make decisions faster than the enemy was the future. These conclusions were not philosophical musings. They became the foundation of systematic military development. The General War School, though officially disbanded by Versailles Treaty requirements, continued its work in various forms. Selected officers underwent intensive courses that covered far more than military tactics alone. They studied logistics, understanding that armies moved on supply lines. They studied transportation, recognizing that railroads and motor vehicles would define modern warfare. They studied enemy intelligence, learning to understand opponent capabilities and intentions. They studied economics, recognizing that industrial capacity would determine long-term military power. They studied foreign policy, understanding how diplomatic relationships shaped strategic options. The curriculum was comprehensive because the Germans understood that modern warfare required more than tactical skill. It required officers who could think strategically, operationally, and tactically all at once. The training emphasized something that would become crucial in the coming war: independent thinking within a framework of clear intent. German officers were taught explicitly that it was better to make a good decision immediately than to wait and make a perfect decision later. In battle, hesitation was death. Opportunity was fleeting, appearing and vanishing in moments. A commander who waited for perfect information, who delayed action until every uncertainty was resolved, would watch opportunities vanish. This principle was drilled into every officer through countless exercises designed to create pressure, uncertainty, and chaos. The Germans recognized that battle was fundamentally chaotic. No plan survived first contact with the enemy intact. Therefore, officers needed to be comfortable operating in chaos, making decisions with incomplete information, adapting as circumstances changed. This created a culture where junior officers were expected to seize initiative without waiting for permission, where squad leaders were expected to think like company commanders, understanding not just their immediate task, but how their actions contributed to larger objectives, where every soldier understood that in the chaos of battle, the man on the ground often had better information than the general in headquarters miles away. The philosophy extended to something called Führen von vorn, leading from the front. German commanders did not direct battles from comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines. They were expected to be forward where they could see what was happening, with their own eyes where they could make decisions based on direct observation rather than delayed reports filtered through multiple layers of command. This was dangerous. German generals and field officers died at rates far higher than their Allied counterparts, but the advantage in decision-making speed was overwhelming. While Allied commanders waited for reports to travel up the chain of command through proper channels, and for orders to travel back down through the same bureaucratic pathway, German commanders were making decisions in real time based on what they could see. The difference in tempo was measured in hours, sometimes days. By 1933, when the Nazi Party came to power, Germany had spent 14 years building the intellectual framework for a new kind of warfare. The physical tools would come later. The tanks, the aircraft, the motorized divisions were still years away. But the thinking came first, and the thinking was systematic. When Adolf Hitler began openly rebuilding the German military in 1935, violating the Versailles Treaty restrictions, he inherited a force that knew exactly what it wanted to become. The architect of German armored doctrine was Heinz Guderian, a signals officer who had spent the 1920s obsessed with a simple idea that most military thinkers considered absurd. Tanks should not support infantry, advancing slowly to help foot soldiers overcome defensive positions. Tanks should be the main striking force, concentrated into powerful formations supported by motorized infantry and aircraft. This was heresy to military thinkers across Europe, who remembered the slow, vulnerable tanks of World War I. Slow, vulnerable tanks of World War I. Those early tanks had been mechanical nightmares, breaking down constantly, moving at walking speed, vulnerable to artillery and technical failure. But Guderian had studied British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Little Hart. who argued that tanks could revolutionize warfare if used correctly. He had examined Soviet deep battle doctrine, which emphasized penetrating enemy defenses and striking deep into rear areas. He had synthesized these ideas with Prussian concepts of maneuver warfare and decisive battle. The result was something the Western press would eventually call Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The Germans themselves called it Beunkrieg, war of movement. The word Blitzkrieg never appeared in German military manuals. It was a term created by journalists to describe what they witnessed. The concept was to identify a weak point in enemy defenses through careful reconnaissance, then concentrate overwhelming force at that single point, massing tanks, artillery, infantry, and air power in a narrow sector. Break through the defensive line with overwhelming local superiority, even if overall numbers favored the enemy. Then send fast-moving armored columns, panzer divisions deep into enemy rear areas to disrupt command posts, cut supply lines, encircle enemy forces, and create chaos. This required precise coordination between tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support. It required speed of execution. It required the ability to exploit breakthrough opportunities immediately within hours, without waiting for permission from higher command levels. The training systems built during the Wehrmacht era, when Germany had no tanks and officially no general staff, were perfectly designed for exactly this kind of warfare. By 1939, the pieces were in place. The Wehrmacht had grown from 100,000 men to over 3 million. It had divisions, including several panzer divisions built around concentrated armor. It had developed radio communication systems that allowed unprecedented coordination between ground and air forces. This technological advantage was crucial and often overlooked. While Allied tanks still relied on flag signals and runners to communicate, German tank commanders could talk to each other, coordinate movements in real time, and call in air support through radio sets built into command vehicles. Every German tank commander had a radio. Many Allied tank crews had no radios at all, making coordination nearly impossible once combat began. This single technological difference, combined with doctrine that exploited it, created a massive advantage in battlefield tempo. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had been designed from the beginning to support ground operations. Unlike the Royal Air Force, which emphasized strategic bombing and air superiority, or the French Air Force, which was fragmented and poorly coordinated, the Luftwaffe trained extensively with army units. The Stuka dive bomber, that distinctive aircraft with its sirens and inverted gull wings, was essentially flying artillery. It could deliver precise strikes on enemy strong points, breaking through defensive positions that ground artillery struggled to suppress. Stuka pilots trained alongside Panzer commanders, developing procedures for close air support that would prove devastating. Luftwaffe officers and Army officers attended the same staff colleges, studied the same doctrine, and conducted combined arms exercises that emphasized coordination and mutual support. September 1, 1939, Poland. The world got its first demonstration of what Germany had built over 20 years of systematic preparation. At 04:45 hours, the invasion began. The aging German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, positioned in Danzig harbor, under the pretense of celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of Tannenberg, opened fire on Polish fortifications at Westerplatte. This marked the beginning of World War II. Simultaneously, German forces crossed the border from 3 directions. Army Group North attacked from Pomerania and East Prussia. Army Group South drove from Silesia and Slovakia. Over 60 divisions, supported by close to 4,000 aircraft, moved against Polish forces. The Polish army was large, fielding 1 million men and by European standards reasonably equipped. It included excellent cavalry units and competent artillery. Polish soldiers fought with tremendous courage, but they were completely unprepared for the methods Germany employed. The campaign demonstrated speed of operations that shocked military observers worldwide. German forces employed their doctrine exactly as trained. For the first hour, Luftwaffe bombers and fighters hit Polish positions, targeting air defenses, troop concentrations, and transportation networks. The powerful Luftwaffe destroyed much of the Polish Air Force within days, leaving the Polish army at the mercy of German panzer divisions. Armored columns advanced over 100 miles in the first 5 days, a pace that seemed impossible to traditional military thinking. The Luftwaffe achieved air superiority within 48 hours through systematic attacks on Polish airfields, then turned to supporting ground operations and bombing infrastructure. Panzer divisions punched through Polish defensive lines at weak points identified by reconnaissance, then raced deep into rear areas. Polish forces found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply, unable to coordinate counterattacks because their command posts had been overrun or destroyed. The speed with which German tank units cut through Polish lines gave a new name to the lexicon of warfare. The combination of air power and armor in mobile warfare created results that defied conventional expectations. Within 2 weeks, the campaign's outcome was certain. Polish forces launched a counterattack at the Bura River from September 9th to 15th, hoping to exploit German activity in the center. But German Army Group South moved to counter this, channeling the Poles into a battle on a narrow front where they were again encircled. Meanwhile, Heinz Guderian's columns pushed hard into the east. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland from the east, sealing Poland's fate. The last operational Polish unit surrendered. On October 6th, total German casualties were 14,000 dead or missing and 30,000 wounded out of 250,000 troops involved. Polish casualties numbered 66,000 dead, 130,000 wounded, and 400,000 captured out of 800,000 troops. The campaign lasted 35 days from invasion to capitulation, but Poland was viewed by many Western observers as inadequately prepared, using obsolete tactics against modern methods. British and French military leaders convinced themselves that German success against Poland proved nothing about how they would perform against first-rate militaries. The real test would come against France and Britain. That test came on May 10, 1940. At dawn, German forces invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France simultaneously. The attacks involved careful planning, deception, and coordination. The Allied plan was called the Dial Plan, named after the Dial River in Belgium. French and British forces would advance into Belgium to meet the German attack, creating a defensive line along natural barriers. It was sound, conventional military thinking, based on assumptions about how Germany would attack. The Allies expected Germany to repeat its World War I strategy, advancing through Belgium in a wide, sweeping movement. French forces deployed accordingly, moving their best units, including 3 armored divisions, forward into Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force, 390,000 strong, moved to take positions alongside French units. Together, they prepared to fight a defensive battle along prepared lines. France fielded 800,000 men and possessed excellent equipment, including tanks superior to German models in armor and armament. What the Allies did not know was that the main German attack was not coming through Belgium at all. Belgium was a feint, a diversion designed to pull Allied forces away from the real point of attack. The main effort was coming through the Ardennes Forest, a region the French considered impossible for large armored forces. This assumption, repeated by French military leaders with absolute confidence, would prove catastrophic. General Gerd von Runet's Army Group A, with 44 divisions including 7 panzer divisions, advanced through the Ardennes with shocking speed. The forest roads, which French planners assumed would prevent rapid movement, had been scouted by German engineers in peacetime. Routes had been planned. Bridges had been surveyed. Units had practiced movement through similar terrain. Nothing was left to chance. German motorcycle reconnaissance units led the advance, followed by panzer divisions moving in columns. When they reached the Maas River on May 13th, French defenders expected several days of preparation before any crossing attempt. German engineers, working even under fire, constructed bridges across the Meuse in 24 hours, a task French planners assumed would require 4 days minimum. This was not superhuman effort. This was engineers who had trained for exactly this mission using pre-positioned equipment, following practiced procedures. On May 13, 1940, German tanks crossed the Meuse at Sedan, outflanking the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, that enormous chain of fortifications along the Franco-German border. The breakthrough occurred at exactly the point where French defenses were weakest, held by reserve divisions rather than frontline troops. This was not luck. German reconnaissance had identified the weak point through careful observation. German doctrine emphasized exploiting weak points rather than attacking enemy strength head-on. The result was a breach that French forces could not close. Within hours, German panzer divisions were pouring through the gap. Within a day, they were racing across open country toward the English Channel coast. What happened next demonstrated the full power of German training and doctrine applied at operational scale. Armored columns raced toward the English Channel, covering distances in days that conventional military wisdom said would require weeks. Heinz Guderian, commanding 19th Panzer Corps, led from the front in his command vehicle, making decisions in real time. When his superiors ordered him to halt and consolidate, concerned about exposed flanks, he delayed implementing the order for hours, then resumed the advance, arguing that he was conducting reconnaissance in force. This would have been insubordination in any other army. In the German system, it was initiative within commander's intent. German tank commanders trained to think independently and exploit opportunities, made decisions without waiting for orders from higher command. When they encountered resistance, they bypassed it and kept moving, leaving slower motorized infantry to deal with surrounded pockets. The emphasis was always on maintaining momentum, keeping the enemy off balance, preventing them from establishing coherent defensive lines. The speed created paralysis in Allied command structures. By the time British and French commanders received reports of German positions through normal channels, those positions were outdated. German forces were already miles beyond where Allied intelligence placed them. Reports took hours to reach headquarters. Analysis took more hours. Orders took additional hours to transmit back to units. By the time Allied forces moved to counter German positions, those positions had changed. The tempo of operations was simply faster than Allied decision-making cycles could handle. This was not an accident or German luck. This was the result of decades of training that emphasized speed of decision over perfection of information, that empowered junior commanders to act on their own judgment, that pushed command forward to where decisions could be made based on direct observation. British Lieutenant Ian Roger English, commanding the carrier platoon of 8th Battalion Durham Light Infantry, experienced this firsthand. At Wallace near Arras on May 21st, his platoon held positions against German forces that appeared where they should not have been able to appear. They moved with a coordination and speed that defied every assumption about how armies operated. Under his skillful leadership, the carrier platoon performed what his commanders later described as prodigious feats of arms, holding together despite facing superior German forces and the frightening first experience of being dive-bombed by Stukas. French forces, despite having better tanks in many cases, could not coordinate their response. The French B-1BS was superior to any German tank in armor and armament. The Somo S-35 cavalry tank was faster and better armed than German Panzer IIIs, but French tanks were dispersed among infantry divisions for support rather than concentrated for breakthrough. They lacked radios for coordination. Their doctrine did not emphasize the rapid exploitation that German doctrine had refined over 20 years. German forces were inside the Allied decision-making loop, operating at a tempo Allied command structures could not match. By May 19, 1940, German armored forces reached Abbeville on the English Channel coast. They had covered 240 kilometers in 9 days, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and the best French divisions in Belgium from the rest of the French army. The Allies had been outmaneuvered so completely that withdrawal was the only option. From May 26th to June 4th, over 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated from Dunkirk in what became known as Operation Dynamo. The British called it a miracle of deliverance. The Germans called it a victory. The facts supported both interpretations. The Battle of France was not won by superior equipment. This point cannot be emphasized enough because it contradicts popular mythology. German tanks were actually inferior to French tanks in armor and armament in many head-to-head comparisons. The Germans had fewer tanks overall than the combined Allied forces. Only 10% of the German army was motorized. The vast majority still relied on horses for transportation, exactly as armies had for centuries. The victory came from doctrine, from training, from command philosophy. German forces concentrated their armor into powerful panzer divisions instead of dispersing it among infantry for support. German commanders made decisions at the speed of battle instead of the speed of bureaucracy. German soldiers at every level understood their mission and were trained to seize initiative when opportunities appeared. French historian Marc Biel, who fought in the campaign and later wrote a searing analysis titled Strange Defeat, described what he called the Germans' embarrassing skill in appearing where they ought not to have appeared. This was not magic or supernatural ability. This was the result of reconnaissance finding weak points, command making rapid decisions to exploit those weak points, and subordinate commanders executing those decisions with initiative and speed. The training system that created this capability was unlike anything the Allies possessed. From the very beginning of basic training, German soldiers were taught to think 2 levels above their rank. This was not aspirational. This was systematic instruction with measurable standards. Squad leaders participated in company-level exercises where they had to make decisions normally made by captains. Company commanders trained in battalion operations, directing forces 3 times larger than their normal command. The exercises were not scripted. They were designed to create chaos, friction, and uncertainty. Officers were given incomplete information and forced to make decisions anyway. They were punished for hesitation and rewarded for initiative, even when that initiative led to mistakes. The lesson was clear. In combat, doing something was almost always better than doing nothing. Waiting for perfect information meant watching opportunities vanish. Map exercises were conducted at every level from squad to army group. These were not simple classroom exercises with an instructor lecturing about theory. They were intense simulations where officers had to formulate orders quickly, clearly, and precisely under time pressure. The emphasis was always on speed of decision. In combat, the side that made decisions faster would seize and maintain initiative. Junior officers learned this principle so thoroughly that it became instinct, automatic rather than deliberate. As one German officer later explained when describing their training methods, map exercises were the best method of teaching. Without great effort, many decisions were required, and officers, especially young officers, were forced to formulate their orders quickly, clearly, and precisely. During these exercises, all participants had to make decisions and act accordingly. This was done at all levels. Using terrain models or map exercises, a company commander trained his platoon leaders, while platoon leaders trained their squad leaders. The general staff selection process was extraordinarily competitive, creating an elite within an elite. Before World War I, approximately 150 officers were selected annually from the entire officer corps to begin the 3-year course at the Kriegsakademie. These were not political appointments. Selection was based on competitive examination that tested tactics, military history, mathematics, and languages. The examination was designed to identify intelligence, creativity, and leadership potential. At the end of the 3-year course, roughly 30% of those candidates passed final examinations. These exams tested not just military knowledge, but personality, character, general education, and personal behavior. Examiners observed how candidates handled stress, how they interacted with others, how they approached problems. Technical knowledge alone was insufficient. The general staff wanted officers who could think creatively, adapt to changing circumstances, and inspire confidence in subordinates. Those who passed were then assigned to the general staff for 2 years on probation. This was not a guarantee of permanent appointment. It was another phase of testing and evaluation. Probationary general staff officers rotated through different assignments, observed constantly, their performance documented in detailed reports. Only after this probationary period were they offered permanent general staff positions. The system created an elite that enjoyed enormous prestige within the German military. General staff officers were marked by distinctive wide crimson stripes on their trousers. They wore special insignia. They were addressed with particular respect. But this prestige came with brutal expectations that never relaxed. They were expected to function effectively at multiple levels of command simultaneously. They were expected to develop innovative solutions to complex operational problems. When World War II began in 1939, the Kriegsakademie was closed. German military leaders expected the war would be over within months. General staff officers were needed for operational assignments rather than 3-year training courses. But the training system adapted with characteristic thoroughness. 8-week intensive courses replaced the 3-year program. These courses were strongly practice-oriented rather than theoretical. They focused on tactics, supply, transportation, staff work, and enemy intelligence. Students spent more time on map exercises and war games than on lectures. The curriculum emphasized practical skills needed immediately at the front. From 1942, as demand for general staff officers increased and casualties mounted, training was restructured again. The revised program included 6 months of practical training in divisional staff positions, 3 months in higher staff roles, 8 weeks of formal instruction, and a 6-month probationary period. Crucially, much of this training occurred at or near the front lines. The Germans believed firmly that war itself was the best teacher. that no amount of classroom instruction could replace actual combat experience. This philosophy resulted in high casualties among trainees, but it also produced officers who understood combat intimately through direct experience. They did not learn warfare from books alone or from instructors describing battles they had never fought. They learned it from survival, from making decisions under fire, from seeing the results of their orders. The result was a general staff that, even as Germany began losing the war by late 1942, maintained extraordinary tactical and operational competence. German forces in retreat often fought more effectively than Allied forces in advance. Surrounded German units held out longer than seemed possible. Outnumbered German formations inflicted disproportionate casualties. This was not fanaticism alone. This was professional military competence woven into the organizational culture. The decentralized command philosophy created flexibility that Allied forces struggled to match even after learning about it. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel commanded the 7th Panzer Division in France, he routinely made decisions that violated his orders from higher command. He exploited opportunities that his superiors had not foreseen because they were not present to see them. He moved faster than cautious higher planning suggested was prudent, and he succeeded spectacularly because German doctrine valued results over obedience to detailed orders. His 7th Panzer Division earned the nickname Ghost Division because higher command often did not know where it was. It moved so fast that reports could not keep pace. But Rommel understood the intent of the overall campaign. Within that intent, he had freedom to act, and he acted aggressively. This was not chaos or indiscipline. This was disciplined initiative, a subtle but crucial distinction. Every German commander understood the intent of the overall operation through a system of mission briefings that emphasized not just what to do, but why it needed to be done. Within that intent, they had freedom to determine how to accomplish their assigned missions. If circumstances changed, if opportunities appeared that the original plan had not anticipated, if the original plan became impossible due to unexpected enemy actions, commanders were expected to adapt. Waiting for new orders was considered a failure of leadership at every level. This philosophy had risks that became more apparent as the war progressed. Commanders operating with high autonomy could make decisions that did not align with strategic goals they did not fully understand. Coordination between units could break down when everyone was exercising initiative simultaneously in different directions. As the war progressed and Germany found itself on the defensive fighting superior numbers, the system showed its limitations. Static defensive warfare required tighter coordination and more centralized control than the decentralized philosophy naturally provided. But in the offensive operations of 1939 through 1941, Alpha tactic created tempo that Allied forces could not match. German units moved, adapted, and exploited opportunities while Allied units waited for orders and permissions. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. Allied soldiers fighting Germans often felt they were fighting an enemy who could anticipate their moves, who appeared where they should not be, who moved faster than seemed possible. This was not supernatural or attributable to German racial superiority, as Nazi propaganda claimed. This was preparation meeting opportunity. Decades of systematic training had created an army where every leader could function above his current pay grade, where initiative was expected rather than punished, where speed of decision was valued above perfection of plan. The disaster of France in 1940 forced Allied militaries to completely rethink their approach to command and training. British and American officers studied German methods intensively, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how to counter it. General George Patton, who had studied German military literature during his youth, began implementing similar principles in American armored forces with modifications for American military culture. He emphasized short, sharp, furious campaigns. He told subordinate commanders to stay mobile, to keep constant pressure on the enemy, to exploit success rather than waiting for permission to advance. By 1944, when Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy, American forces were operating at tempos that rivaled German capabilities. The Soviet Union, which bore the brunt of German offensive operations in 1941, learned through catastrophic defeat. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, German forces achieved some of the most devastating victories in military history. 3 million German soldiers invaded along a front, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the largest military operation in human history. In the opening weeks, the Wehrmacht encircled hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in massive cauldron battles at Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, Oman, and Kiev. German panzer divisions advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. By the end of 1941, over 3 million Soviet soldiers were prisoners of war. The initial German success seemed to validate every aspect of their doctrine and training. But the Soviets adapted with brutal pragmatism. They learned to create defense in depth that could absorb German breakthrough attempts without collapsing. They learned to keep operational reserves positioned to counterattack German spearheads once they had advanced beyond their supporting infantry. They learned that German armored columns, when they advanced too far too fast, had vulnerable flanks that could be attacked. Most importantly, Soviet commanders began to match German tempo of operations. What had worked devastatingly against slow-moving Allied forces in France worked less well against opponents who could match German speed of decision. By 1943 at Kursk, the Soviets were executing operational maneuvers that rivaled German sophistication. By 1943, the advantage had shifted decisively. Allied forces had learned to use combined arms coordination that rivaled German capabilities. They had developed their own rapid decision-making processes and mission command systems. American armor doctrine explicitly borrowed German concepts adapted for American conditions. British forces, after hard lessons in North Africa, reformed their training and tactical systems. And critically, the Allies had industrial production that Germany could not hope to match. American factories alone produced more tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ammunition than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The Soviet Union, despite losing enormous territory and population, relocated factories beyond German reach and outproduced Germany in most categories of weapons. No amount of tactical excellence could overcome this material imbalance indefinitely, but the lessons of German effectiveness remained relevant even in defeat. German forces in Normandy in 1944, fighting a defensive battle against overwhelming odds, inflicted casualty rates that shocked Allied commanders. Between D-Day on June 6 and the end of August 1944, 83,000 British, Canadian, and Polish troops became casualties in the Normandy campaign, with almost 16,000 killed. The German army was fighting with complete Allied air superiority, meaning Luftwaffe support was nearly non-existent. German forces faced critical supply shortages because Allied aircraft interdicted transportation networks. They were outnumbered in tanks, artillery, and infantry. Despite these crushing disadvantages, they demonstrated tactical excellence that prolonged the campaign far beyond what Allied planners had expected. This was not fanaticism alone, though ideological commitment played a role. This was the product of a military culture that had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of warfare. German soldiers at every level understood their mission in the context of larger operations. They understood commander intent, allowing them to adapt when situations changed. They had been trained to make decisions under pressure without waiting for orders. The non-commissioned officer corps deserves particular emphasis in understanding German effectiveness. German NCOs were not simply enforcers of discipline who maintained order and relayed officers' commands. They were junior leaders systematically trained to think at levels far above their rank. A German squad leader, typically holding the rank of Unteroffizier, was expected to understand platoon and company operations in detail. The quality of the German NCO in World War II was that he was not just able to lead his squad, but that he could make a valuable contribution by thinking himself into the position of the platoon, or even the company commander. A squad leader had to be able to lead his squad and employ his weapons effectively, but this was not enough. He had to be able to lead a platoon. He had to be able to think on the level of the company. This system was characteristic of all German army command levels. Many German NCOs could step into officer roles if needed and perform adequately. This meant that when casualties occurred among officers, which happened with grim in combat, units could continue functioning effectively. The leadership depth went down to the lowest levels of the organization. Platoons that lost their lieutenant could be led by the senior sergeant. Companies that lost their captain could be commanded by the senior platoon sergeant until an officer replacement arrived. Training for NCOs emphasized the same fundamental principles as officer training. They participated in map exercises where they had to make decisions at company and battalion level. They practiced Decision M under pressure, using the same methods officers used. They studied combined arms operations, understanding how artillery, infantry, armor, and air support worked together. A German squad leader participated in training exercises at company and battalion level, not as a spectator, but as an active participant making decisions. He understood how his squad fit into larger operations, how his actions contributed to company and battalion objectives. This created cohesion and coordination that did not rely solely on officers being present to direct every action. The comparison with Allied NCOs was stark and significant. British and American NCOs were often excellent at their specific level of command. A British sergeant could be superb at leading his section. An American platoon sergeant could be outstanding at his job, but they were not systematically trained to think multiple levels above their position. When officers became casualties, Allied units often lost significant effectiveness because NCOs had not been prepared to step up to officer-level decision-making. The German system assumed that casualties would occur, that communications would break down, that chaos was the natural state of battle. Training reflected these assumptions. Every non-commissioned officer was prepared to function at least one level above his current position. This redundancy in leadership created resilience under the catastrophic conditions of modern combat, where casualties among junior officers were horrific. The Wehrmacht's success in the early war years rested on this foundation of systematic, intensive, multi-level training that created leaders at every rank from Army Group Commander down to squad leader. It was reinforced by doctrine that emphasized speed of action, maneuver over attrition, and concentration of force at decisive points. It was enabled by technology, particularly radio communications, that allowed the tempo of operations the doctrine required, but technology alone was not sufficient to explain German success. The Allies had radios too. French forces had radios. British forces had excellent communication equipment. What they lacked was a command culture that fully exploited the potential of instant communication to increase tempo of operations. German commanders expected to communicate with subordinates constantly, giving brief updates of intent and receiving rapid reports of changing situations. This created a shared understanding of the battlefield that allowed rapid adaptation without lengthy coordination procedures. When opportunities appeared, exploitation could begin immediately because subordinate commanders understood what their superiors wanted to achieve and had authority to act without waiting for specific permission. The combination of technology and doctrine created capabilities greater than either element alone could provide. The greatest tribute to German effectiveness came from their enemies after the war. American and British military institutions studied German methods with intense focus, trying to distill lessons that could be applied. The United States Army conducted extensive interviews with German generals and staff officers. The British analyzed German training methods and organizational structures. Both recognized that German operational and tactical methods had proven superior despite strategic failure and material inferiority. The concept of mission command became central to Western military doctrine, explicitly because it had proven so effective in German hands. The emphasis on initiative at lower levels became standard in American and British training. The focus on tempo of operations, on making decisions faster than the enemy, became a key measure of military effectiveness. These were not abstract concepts. These were practical lessons learned through defeat and study. The United States Army's Eland battle doctrine of the 1980s was explicitly based on German operational concepts from World War II. The emphasis on speed, agility, synchronized combined arms operations, and deep strikes into enemy rear areas all echoed what the Wehrmacht had demonstrated decades earlier. The intellectual debt was acknowledged openly in doctrinal publications and training materials. Modern military forces around the world now teach mission command as a fundamental principle of leadership and operations. The idea that subordinates should understand commander intent and have freedom to execute within that intent is now considered standard best practice. Training emphasizes initiative and decision-making under pressure. Officers are taught to think two levels above their current position. These are direct inheritances from German methods studied and adapted. But in 1940, this was revolutionary rather than standard. It gave Germany a decisive advantage in the opening years of the war. an advantage that could only be overcome when opponents learned similar methods and backed them with industrial production Germany could not match. The story of German military effectiveness in World War II is ultimately a story about preparation, training, and doctrine applied systematically over decades. It demonstrates conclusively that how an army thinks, how it trains its leaders, how it structures decision-making processes, these intangible factors can be as important as numbers and equipment. The Wehrmacht of 1940 had fewer tanks than the Allied forces it defeated. It had fewer motorized units proportionally. Overall force ratios were comparable, but it had spent 20 years developing training systems that created leaders who could operate at a tempo Allied forces initially could not match. This does not diminish Allied bravery, sacrifice, or eventual success. British, French, Polish, Belgian, and Dutch soldiers fought courageously against an enemy, operating with methods they had never encountered, and were not trained to counter. Many Allied units performed superbly with the doctrine and training they had been given. Individual Allied soldiers were not inferior, but doctrine and training systems were inadequate for the kind of war Germany brought to Europe in 1940. The Allied response, learning and adapting under the immense pressure of combat and defeat, eventually turned the tide of war. By 1944, British and American forces were executing operations that rivaled German tempo and far exceeded German resources. Soviet forces had learned to match and in some cases exceed German operational art, applying it with the ruthless determination that characterized Soviet military culture. But in 1940, in those 6 weeks when France fell and Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, the German military machine demonstrated conclusively what decades of focused preparation could achieve. The training that began in the restricted Reich era of the 1920s when Germany was forbidden tanks and aircraft created a culture of military excellence. The doctrine that synthesized centuries of Prussian military tradition with modern technology created methods that revolutionized warfare. The command philosophy that trusted junior leaders to seize initiative within clear intent created organizational agility that opponents could not match. All these elements combined to create victories that seemed impossible by conventional military calculation and shook the confidence of democracies worldwide. The lessons remain profoundly relevant for understanding military effectiveness beyond simple metrics of equipment and numbers. Military capability is not purely a function of tank counts or division numbers. It is fundamentally a function of how forces are trained, how decisions are made, how initiative is encouraged or suppressed, how leaders at every level understand their role in larger operations. The German military of 1940 had turned these intangible factors into a systematic approach that changed warfare permanently. That system eventually failed when strategic overreach met overwhelming Allied industrial and numerical superiority. No amount of tactical excellence could overcome fighting the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously. But the tactical and operational methods survived the strategic defeat, studied intensively, and adopted with modifications by the very nations that had defeated Germany militarily. When military historians look back at World War II and analyze German effectiveness, the conclusion remains clear across decades of scholarship. Germany built a military machine that emphasized speed of thought as much as speed of movement, that trained every leader to function above their rank, that gave subordinates freedom to act within clear intent. This created a tempo of operations and level of tactical competence that opponents initially could not match. The advantage was temporary, lasting only until enemies learned similar methods and applied them with greater resources. But for a critical period in history, it created victories that reshaped the war and demonstrated principles that would reshape all modern warfare. The German military of 1940 was not invincible, as Nazi propaganda claimed. It was simply operating on principles opponents had not yet mastered, applied by leaders trained systematically over 2 decades. Once those principles became common knowledge, once Allied forces adopted similar methods and backed them with overwhelming industrial resources and numerical superiority, the advantage disappeared completely. But the achievement remains historically remarkable and worthy of serious study divorced from ideological considerations. Through systematic training, coherent doctrine, and command philosophy that trusted subordinates, Germany created a force that could defeat numerically superior enemies through speed, coordination, and initiative. That achievement, studied and learned from by all modern professional militaries, stands as testimony to the enduring power of how an army thinks, how it prepares its people, and how it leads in combat. The methods pioneered by the Wehrmacht, stripped of their association with Nazi ideology, became foundational elements of Western military doctrine and remain relevant to understanding military effectiveness in any era. The transformation of enemy soldiers like British Lieutenant Ian Roger English, who witnessed German effectiveness firsthand and later became a highly decorated officer, represents the broader recognition that what Germany achieved militarily was worth studying and learning from, even by those who had fought against it. English himself would go on to win the Military Cross 3 times for his leadership and tactical skill, applying lessons learned from facing an enemy that had redefined modern warfare. His journey from witnessing German effectiveness at Juarez in May 1940 to becoming one of only 24 British soldiers to earn the Military Cross 3 times during the war reflects the broader Allied learning process. The story of German military effectiveness is not a story of superiority or inherent advantage. It is a story of what systematic preparation, coherent thinking, and rigorous training can achieve when applied consistently over decades. It is a testament to the power of organizational culture, the importance of empowering subordinates, and the decisive advantage that comes from making decisions faster than opponents can react. These lessons transcend the specific historical context and remain relevant for any organization facing competition in complex, rapidly changing environments. The Wehrmacht's early war successes demonstrated that success comes not from resources alone, but from how those resources are organized, trained, and employed. The subsequent Allied victory demonstrated that even superior methods can be learned and countered when opponents commit to adaptation and back it with overwhelming material advantage. The complete story from German innovation through Allied adaptation to ultimate German defeat provides insights into military effectiveness, organizational learning, and the relationship between tactical excellence and strategic success that military professionals continue to study today. The methods that made Germany so effective in World War II live on in modern military doctrine. A lasting legacy of systematic preparation, meeting the crucible of combat.